Hello and welcome to this introduction to wildlife of Belize. I will give you some examples of our patients seen at the BWRC, mention their conservation status and some of the common threats. My name is Dr. Isabelle Baquiluron and I am the veterinarian and director at the BWRC. Here is number one, to mention some of the commonly seen injuries and or threats. These are two patients, one on the right with a head trauma from hitting a wall, and the one on the left with a gunshot hole here to his beak. What we're seeing here is the keelbill toucan, Belize's national bird, with many different common names in our different languages, representative of Belize. And then we also have our Latin name, Ramphastus sulphuratus. To talk a little bit about conservation status, the IUCN lists them as LC. So what does that mean? The IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the IUCN has created and compiles the Red List, which is the most extensive list of conservation status of species. And we can go through the different levels. We saw the keelbill toucan is listed as LC, which means least concern. This means that they are not likely to become extinct in the near future. We will see different species throughout this presentation that are threatened with extinction, from vulnerable to endangered to a couple of critically endangered species as well. And then I wanted to briefly introduce CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And the keelbill toucan is listed by CITES on Appendix 2. This means that the trade is to be monitored. So CITES is a convention that has been signed by over 140 countries globally, agreeing to protect certain species and limit or control their trade. The appendices, Appendix 1 is the most endangered or threatened by traffic and most controlled, and Appendix 3 is the least. So to mention some threats to our keelbill toucans here, we have habitat loss and pet trade, as well as human-wildlife conflict, and to some level also hunting for consumption. These are also the most common threats that you will hear over and over throughout a lot of this presentation on our former patients. This toucan, however, was recently released. So here is a next species that we see very frequently at the clinic, and I don't have a representative picture of how you see them in the wild, which is usually in troops of animals of 5 to 15 or even 20 or more, depending on food availability. And so the common names are coati or pisote, or here in Creole, quash. Latin Nasonarica. By IUCN, they are not threatened with extinction. CITES does list them to be monitored in the trade, and their threats are habitat loss, again, the pet trade, and can cause human-wildlife conflict as well. So here is one of our former patients turned into a little poster to tell their stories and avoid the repetition of their stories. We see between 5 and 15 of these babies per year, some of which are true orphans, and others are poached for the pet trade and confiscated by the government. And then they are reared to release whenever possible. Another more commonly known species probably that we do also see in the pet trade. We also see them as actual legal pets in the United States. Bear as well. They are not threatened with extinction currently, but threatened by habitat loss. And then again, human-wildlife conflict as well. So we do see patients that come in after a dog attack with some regularity. And this picture, however, was one of our patients that made it to release. So this is, again, a happy picture. Here, dangerous species, not a patient at the clinic, and one of the few species that we will not respond to, but refer out. This is the furulence, also called yellow jaw for the yellow tinge on their lower jaw, or barba amarilla in Spanish, or by Latin name Botrops asper. This is the most common venomous snake and the most common cause of envenomation as well. If you would like to learn more about snake identification and how to stay safe, you can contact us at our email below. And we do also have a short presentation on just snakes of Belize to help with identification of the common venomous snakes, for example. So here, another very charismatic species. In a rehabilitation pool in this picture, so not your classic looking picture, but maybe still recognizable. This is the so-called sea cow, or the West Indian manatee, or vaca marina. The manatee's status is vulnerable, and they are listed on CITES Appendix 1, and they are also listed on the USA ESA. So that abbreviation ESA stands for the Endangered Species Act, which applies in the US. And since the range of the species goes all the way to the US and southern US, they are also listed under the ESA. So the most common threats to manatees, also known from the US, are boat injury. And then, unfortunately, occasionally, poaching is also a threat to this species. What you see in this picture was actually a necropsy done on a manatee that had been hit by a boat, and you can see here these classic lines of propeller strikes down the body. Belize is fortunate to have a manatee rehabilitation program and center where many orphans and some boat strikes that are not as severe as this one was are also tended to and rehabilitated back for release quite successfully. So yeah, ESA is Endangered Species Act, that is US legislation and does not apply to us here in Belize. Excuse me. Here we have our next quite commonly seen species in the juvenile version and the fully feathered sub-adult version. This is the white-fronted Amazon parrot, listed as least concern, listed by CITES to monitor trade. Their main threats are, as most or all species almost, habitat loss, but a strong impact of illegal wildlife traffic. And then they're also sometimes victims of human-wildlife conflict, mostly getting into people's citrus plants or others where people feel bothered by them or feeling bothered by the noise. What you can see here is a somewhat typical intake, can be where the wings were clipped and then the bird was relinquished. Two different patients, again, of the same charismatic species that we have seen in total around 100 patients now in the last few years. And so this is the howler monkey or mono aullador, alhuatapigra. These are protected species and listed as endangered by the IUCN, as well as on Appendix 1 by CITES. And then the WPA, Wildlife Protection Act, brings me actually to the Belizean piece of legislation, which protects all species of wildlife from harassment, molestation, hunting, etc., with the exceptions of species that are listed in schedules to the Wildlife Protection Act. So the howler monkey is completely protected under the Wildlife Protection Act and not listed on the schedule of game species. The threats to our primates are, again, habitat loss, but also a very strong impact of wildlife traffic, which is being addressed by governmental programs and enforcement, as well as cooperating NGOs. So yeah, one of our most fortunate rescue stories was Spartacus, who came in 2011, which was actually prior to the clinic and somewhat the reason the clinic was started. He was a very young baby who had his hand nearly severed. I tended to him without a clinic and then applied for help to start a clinic, which was granted. And in the process of this monkey was turned into our logo. He actually kept his hand recovered, had a follow-up surgery in 2013, and was released. And in 2015, I got the news that he had turned a father, and he has now been in the wild for 5 years and is thriving and has fathered many, many children. So from our end, that's a very fortunate story to go from a very hurt and injured baby to a free range, successful head of a troop. So having seen the first species, it's probably easy to recognize what group this guy belongs into. This is again a juvenile, a fledgling, to be a bit more specific. And this is the collared aracari in the group of toucans. These guys are threatened again by habitat loss and the pet trade, but they are currently not listed as endangered. They are protected under the Wildlife Protection Act as well. So here another intake picture of a orphaned baby who was named Felix. And this is by common name the margay, or also called tiger cat here, or tigrillo, like little tiger. And a quick note on all of our felines here are called tigers by common name, somewhat unrelated to their size, because this is a small cat. Their adult weight is between 4 and 7 kilos. They are no longer considered, or they're near threatened at this point. They're no longer endangered, thanks in part to CITES as well, where they are listed on Appendix 1, which has mostly eliminated the trade in furs, which used to be their largest threat in the 1980s. The margay is also listed on the USA Endangered Species Act because this species does range all the way up into some southern spots of the United States. In Belize, they are protected by the Wildlife Protection Act, which again covers in the introduction all species, native species of wildlife in Belize. Mammals, birds, and reptiles. So here we have a universalist that many of you are likely familiar with, because this is another one of those species that we share between Belize and North America. It's a very common species in North America. They're common here as well, but not as common as in the US in my experience. So this is your classic Virginia opossum, juveniles again. Interestingly enough, by common name, these are also called zorro in Spanish, which otherwise translated would mean fox. So an example for where common names can often be somewhat confusing, and there's usually many of them, but the Latin names in general rarely change. So Didelphis virginiana. The threats to the opossum, they are not endangered. They are protected under the Wildlife Protection Act, but they are often victims of human-wildlife conflict and or abuse by people who dislike particularly opossums. Nonetheless, they're quite useful to the environment, and they clean up a lot of debris, including ticks in the backyards. So we try to do our part to educate people. Here, another majestic animal. I am not sure if this bar, oh my goodness, this bar has been in the way. to admire at our world unique Belize Zoo is where this majestic bird has just started to eat. It's the harpy eagle. They are near threatened by IUCN, which frankly surprises me right now. They are listed on Appendix 1 and on the Endangered Species Act. The numbers for that species are not known to me currently, but very low. In 2009, the first nest of a harpy eagle was discovered in Belize in 60 years. Then the nest had not been found. And somewhere close to 20 birds have been released by international efforts here in Belize. So by those numbers, a very, very rare species that is threatened by habitat loss. But human wildlife conflict is probably the biggest threat to all of our raptors, and the bigger, the worse. And then I've personally also heard myths about harpies that create a bigger fear factor that make that a number of them have gotten shot and died as a consequence, unfortunately. So these two of a kind, two species in the same group, of crassids. We do have a third species in that same group that I do not have pictured here, that we do also not commonly see as a patient. These two, however, came in with similar background stories of being found on illegal poachers inside a protected area as very tiny chicks. Here they are near grown up, so they were reared successfully, but as individuals who had no conspecifics to grow up with, they did in the end not get to be released, but one went to the zoo. And there we go. And that is the crested guan, or Penelope purpurescens, on the left, and the curassow, Crux rubra. Both of those species are listed as least concern, but in our Wildlife Protection Act, they are listed on the schedule as game species. This means that both of those can legally be hunted with a permit. This hunting has to happen outside of protected areas and during the open season and follow a short list of guidelines and regulations. So these guys can legally be hunted, but we did see several of them that had been illegally hunted inside protected areas, or in the case of chicks, most likely their parents had been hunted and then the chicks were taken by the poachers, which then again is illegal because the Wildlife Protection Act also stipulates that animals cannot be hunted when they have offspring. An unusual species as a title here. This is maybe not a species that many people that are not from this region are familiar with. A very interesting species, an interesting one to see as a patient. What you see here is the defensive posture. Their quills are mostly experienced by dogs, and veterinary clinics will sometimes see the dogs that come in after they've tried to attack one of these guys. Their quills are a good armor and defense. The one on the left is actually past release and about to walk away, but he is not even yet interested in walking away, but he is threatening towards the releaser and waiting for us to step back. So by common name, this is the Mexican hairy porcupine, or also the prehensile-tailed porcupine. The threats to them, the main threat is human-wildlife conflict, being with dogs. And then we have to include this myth buster, because there is a common myth around here that these animals can actually shoot their quills up to between 3 and 10 meters far, like darts. And yes, this is very, very far from reality. In reality, these quills are modified hair, very, very thick hair, and they are firmly attached to the porcupine. And when they do have barbs, so when a dog or an animal or a human grabs these quills, they will get stuck and they will rip out of the porcupine. And this is actually quite painful to them. Just imagine ripping out a very big, thick hair, and then multiply that. And the next problem for them losing their quills is that that is their main defense. So it is not in their interest to shoot quills after things unless they do get touched and picked up, at which point the quills will get stuck on most anything. But if left alone, they are very harmless. And they're also nocturnal and arboreal species, which generally can keep them out of trouble, minus short stints when they come into human settlements. And then that's conflict. Here, another very charismatic species and another famous patient who came in on the official opening day of the Belize Wildlife Clinic as a severely compromised, dehydrated baby with multiple broken bones and 5 bullets in her. She too has a happy ending in that she survived her injuries, recovered all the broken bones, and is still in a rehabilitation program at this point. But this is the so-called spider monkey, spider monkey, or mono aranya, by Latin name Ateles girofloi. Actually, there are a few typos on this slide, I apologize. By IUCN, they are listed as endangered and they are on Appendix 1. They are also protected under the Wildlife Protection Act in Belize. The threats, as mentioned already for the howler monkeys, again, are wildlife traffic and then again, habitat loss. As humans expand and agricultural expansion continues, more and more wildlife habitat becomes fragmented, and we do see an increasing number of displaced monkeys or lost monkeys at times that need relocation. So another species very common by numbers. You can see this patient is obviously eating. He had suffered a broken wing. which is a very common injury from hitting vehicles or gunshot. Both can happen for these. This is the olive-throated parakeet. They occur in large flocks, and they do get threatened by both traffic as illegal pets and then human-wildlife conflict where they get shot for getting into people's plants. Here another drastic picture of one of our intakes, exemplifying one of the threats to the species as well. You may be able to see some differences to the margay shown a while ago, where this cat is much more massive and stocky and has smaller eyes compared to the head size. And yeah, the tail is short but not really visible here. So this is another rescue from illegal traffic. And the ocelot, another tiger or tiger cat. These are listed on Appendix 1 by CITES and again on the United States Endangered Species Act because they do occur in the most southern tips of the US, and they have the same threats as the margays, with habitat loss and human-wildlife conflict, which for both of these smaller cat species happens often over chickens or other small domestic animals, and they're threatened by the pet trade. The skin trade and poaching for parts does also occasionally happen, but is much decreased compared to, well, last century, before CITES, but unfortunately still seen. This is an extreme brief survivor patient, that again, a species we share, that is not of conservation concern, that is by some, in some regions, considered a pest. Here, I want to pause. I apologize for the delay with the dogs barking. So this guy came in as a rescue after having been run over by a tractor. The armadillo, or nine-banded armadillo, also commonly in Creole called dilly here, is listed as a game species on the Wildlife Protection Act and can therefore legally be hunted with a permit. And we do see them sometimes as orphans that are found, and or once again, the government finds people inside protected areas or with animals that they do not have a permit for, and they found them at times with baby armadillos that, again, were likely acquired when poaching mothers or so, and then they are in turn reared for release back into the wild. This is another example of a species that we have not seen as a patient at the BWRC yet itself. This is a picture by colleague Tony Gorell, who is the reference for venomous snakes in Belize, I would say, or one of several. So the tropical rattlesnake, definitely one species to be very, very careful with, very venomous. They only occur in a limited range here in the pine forests, and they will generally warn ahead, and they're not an aggressive species by nature, but their main threat would be humans. And in general, the approach to most snakes here by most humans is to try to kill them, which out of fear, in this case, endangering humans as well. Here, very, very charismatic, our red gold of the chicky ball, the scarlet macaws, from the tiny chick to the nearly fledgling chick and the free ones. They are listed on Appendix 1 for CITES, but by IUCN they are considered of least concern, even though our numbers here in Belize are just around 300 animals are left. Their biggest threat is poaching. They do have natural threats by predators and hurricanes as well, but they are locally certainly very endangered and listed on the Wildlife Protection Act. So here is another one of our game species, actually, that in North America is a classic pet species. These are green iguanas, also called guana or bamboo chicken, indicating that they are a favorite game meat for many. They are listed as least concern, and on Appendix 2, they are certainly threatened by habitat loss and illegal hunting. And a big problem is the fact that pregnant females are considered a delicacy, which of course is a big threat to the species continuing. Here is another universalist that we share between North and Central America, only that ours here are on average smaller. This is the gray fox. And then here we have another interesting species. Important morphologic criterion to look for is this big fat stripe over the ears. This is the notorious red-eared slider, which is not a native species, but an invasive species, and globally invasive species, which competes and harms our native species. We do have a local neotropical slider that looks very similar, and hybridization between the species is also reported. This species is a threat to wild populations, and that threat once again originates from humans who purchase them as pets and then get tired of them and release them back into the wild, into non-native habitats, and they thrive. Here is our national mammal. This is at the Belize Zoo, and a charismatic and generally known species, I assume. This is the Baird's tapir, or also here called mountain cow, which tells you one of their threats. They are occasionally poached. The Spanish common name is ganta. They are listed as endangered, and on Appendix 1, their biggest threat is habitat loss, vehicle collisions, as well as some poaching. Alarming colors. Again, this was not a patient at the clinic, but picture credit to Tony Gorell. This is the coral snake, or one of two species of coral snakes that we have here in Belize. They're very venomous, but they very rarely bite. And when handled safely, aka not handled and left alone, the chances of bites are very slim. Threat to them is human-wildlife conflict, hence being in the wrong place, and fear, so they often do get killed. Here we have a naturally curious animal in the mustelid family. This is a juvenile here. Here he is a little bit older. They're commonly also called bush dog or grison, or the great grison, greater grison, by Latin name Gallictus vittata. They are not threatened with extinction at this time, but they are threatened with habitat loss. And we have seen several patients as fire victims. So after fire, for mostly agricultural expansion, orphans are found with burn wounds. But these were returned back to the wild. There is another not very common patient without conservation concerns at this time. Very large rodent teeth. This is the Central American agouti, also called bush rabbit. They are a game species here again and can legally be hunted. So here an orphan, here an injured adult. This is the talandra. And their biggest threats are habitat loss once again and vehicle collisions. Crossing the roads. So this is generally an arboreal species, but when they cross roads, in Brazil, their most common cause of death was determined as road traffic accidents. Here we have another game species. Morphologic criterion that helps with identification here is this white band. This is the so-called collared peccary, the smaller species of peccary here in Belize. They are on the schedule to the Wildlife Protection Act and the game species, and yet threatened by illegal hunting and habitat loss. Here we have another beautiful yet venomous viper. This is three versions, three morphologic varieties of the same species. You can see the morphologic criterion here that helps in the identification. Those are eyelash vipers. They are venomous, but not documented cause of envenomation here. They're arboreal and their prey is generally fairly small. So here another patient on intake and after rehydration. This was another orphan, another species we share between north and south. The mountain lion or another tiger or puma. And here we have another baby bird. This was an injured baby bird, slowly turning into an adult of large proportions. This species is only seen in this region here. So this is the Jabiru stork. They are threatened by habitat loss and then again human-wildlife conflict. They're a very large bird, and next we have one more of our cats here in Belize, a rather cryptic species, the so-called halari or jaguarundi. They are listed on Appendix 1. And they are not as threatened. I didn't even write it here. They're not as threatened by the pet trade. They weren't as threatened by the fur trade either. They are IUCN listed as least concern. And here we have another, we already had him. That's the great curassow again, Crux rura, threatened by habitat loss and illegal hunting. So The earlier picture was a juvenile, and here is an adult male. Here we have another consumed species in Belize, a favorite of many. They're called hicatee or tortuga blanca. By Latin name, it's Dermatemis maui, and they are now critically endangered. So this is actually the first species in this presentation here that is critically endangered, which is the last step before extinct in the wild. This means that a strong population decline has been shown, and now conservation measures are in action. It's been several years already. These pictures here are taken at a breeding program here with ultrasound in adults, and here are babies being captive hatched at this point to reinforce wild populations who are not yet extinct but locally disappearing. And yeah, there is the National Research and Breeding Center at Be Free. That needs a shout out. In the future, I will make this a quiz where people can guess before I say anything. This is another rodent species, commonly or locally here also known as the royal rat, because this is a game species. And it was fed to the queen when she visited us the last time as a local delicacy. Hence, it's a rodent, it's a rat, and the queen ate it. This cute orphan here that was rescued is by a common name vipaka or gibnut or agutipaka. They're again a game species with a closed and an open season and some rules applying to the hunting. And then here we come to a non-game species that is protected under the Wildlife Protection Act in Belize. And this is the, every time I move it, American crocodile. So we have two species of crocodiles here in Belize. One is Crocodylus acutus, which you just saw. They are listed as endangered and on CITES Appendix 1 and also protected in the US as a species that ranges up there. And then we have this here, which is not the same species, but this is the Moralett's crocodile, which is the river crocodile, one could say. Their habitat is more inland in Belize, in sweet water up the rivers, and the American crocodile occurs more along the coast and on some of the keys and mangroves. They do have an overlap area, and there again is also reported hybridization. So how do we tell them apart? Side by side to make it a little more easy. One can see that the American crocodile has this preorbital hump here, which the Moralett's crocodile does not have. The American's crocodile, the snout is a lot more narrow and acute, and on the Moralett's, it is broader and wider. And then here are the scutes post-cloaca, which are very regular on the American and irregular on the Moralett's, but I don't encourage anybody to go up that close unless that is your line of work. Obviously, this little bump on the nose is actually something that sticks out from afar and can be seen with a lens. So yeah, one of the more exciting rescues was this orphan who was found near drowning in a lake. And this was a jaguar, also commonly called tiger here, or better called Panthera onca. They are listed on Appendix 1 and on our Wildlife Protection Act, always protected. Unless an animal threatens a human or his or her livelihood. This refers to a next paragraph in the Wildlife Protection Act, which of course places human safety first. So a human is allowed to defend themselves or their livelihood. And human-wildlife conflict is a huge topic that you've heard throughout here, threatening most or many of these species. And they are the biggest predator, and coexistence is probably the most difficult concern when it comes to the jaguars. So I thought there was one more picture of, no, there's not. So this is Chicky. She was rescued in the Chicky Bowl. She did survive. She overcame pneumonia. As a wild jaguar raised by humans, she could not be returned to the wild here in Belize. And she found a wonderful permanent home at the Belize Zoo, where she's now an ambassador for her species again and can be visited Chiquiwal. So to summarize this whole brief presentation, which is by no means complete, there are many, many common species missing. Belize has an amazing biodiversity, many very fascinating, unique species. For many species, we do have healthy populations or that are not yet immediately threatened with extinction, but we also do see a lot of vulnerable, endangered and or critically endangered species. And there's, for example, the yellow-headed Amazon parrots, which I did not yet list in this, that are also critically endangered, which means they will disappear in the next few years if effective intervention is not done. And the common threats are repeated over and over and over, with habitat loss, which of course threatens almost all wildlife species, and then the ubiquitous human-wildlife conflict over chickens or over vegetables or over fruit or over living space in people's attics and walls, that threaten many species unnecessarily, and then illegal traffic as the worst global threat to biodiversity, leading to species extinction globally. So yeah, what can you do to protect our biodiversity? To end on a more hopeful note, is educate yourself more about what species are present where you are, learn about the common conflicts that are there in your area. For example, raccoons are a whole topic of discussion, and find out about non-lethal conflict resolution, and deterrence, and actually learn about attracting wildlife, hence how inadvertently we so often attract wildlife that then causes us problems, to ultimately learn more about coexistence with these amazing species. And when it comes to wildlife traffic, it is a tragic, sad topic with a tremendous amount of death and suffering for wildlife, leading to extinctions. And we still encourage people to educate themselves about it, because oftentimes humans don't even really know and then inadvertently engage in it or encourage the traffic in illegal species or traffic in illegal parts of wildlife as well, be it jaguar teeth or shark teeth or more. So I would like to end by encouraging you to email us with any questions you may have, and to find the BWRC on Facebook, and we do have an Instagram page as well, and a website. And let us know if you would like to learn more. And we would like to say thank you so much for your attention, and we stand by to answer any questions, since this can at this point not be interactive. We hope you enjoyed to learn a little bit about some common and or unusual or special patients. And yes, this last patient here is a former human-wildlife conflict jaguar who was relocated into captivity at the Belize Zoo, and he actually received dental work here because he broke his canines, which led to him needing root canals done by a veterinary dentist, and I got to assist with the anesthesia. So thank you very much. And to end on the vampire bat picture here. And this is especially important because they are one of our reservoirs for the rabies virus. But back to the jaguar, and let me stop the recording now. My apologies. It's only the second time.